Thank you for joining the Resilient Cyber Show. My name is Chris Hughes, and today I'm joined by Mitch Herckis from the Wiz team. Mitch, thanks for being here.
Happy to be here. Exciting to chat with you again.
Yeah, it's been a while since you and I've chatted. I think we had coffee kind of pre the announcement of Google and Wiz, and I think many people have been tracking that news. But for folks, if there is even such a thing as someone in my network that doesn't know who Wiz is, can you tell us a bit about the Wiz team as well as yourself and your role there?
Sure. So, Wiz is about a 5-year-old and change company, but was among the fastest growing software companies of all time. And essentially, we have 4 founders who, left Microsoft and had an idea for how to do security better in the cloud. And Wiz was born out of that. Essentially, it's a new approach to building visibility and understanding risk across multiple cloud environments and complex and changing environments in general. In the world we're in, especially if you consider where we've come from 5 years ago to today, particularly with COVID, everyone is in the cloud these days on some level, but not just in one cloud, in multiple cloud environments. And those environments keep getting increasingly complex, whether it's because of the addition of AI or hybrid environments or, spread across the globe. So, how do we stitch that together? How do we understand the risk across these complex and ever-changing environments as we add new APIs with human and non-human identities, misconfiguration of risk, all of that just takes a lot of planning, and we really can't scale the personnel and workforce to do it the old way we were doing it. So by stitching together and providing the risk patterns, essentially, on a continuous basis, that really helps us understand where we need to focus our attention first, but also allowing for rapid access to understanding what's in your environment when a new risk comes out, say, a new open source vulnerability, whatever it may be. That is what Wiz, kind of the secret sauce of Wiz is. So it's been a great ride. I've been on board about 2 years now, a little less. And we've just been growing like a rocket ship during that whole time. Recently, Google came into the picture with an offer to acquire us, which is going to be an exciting ride in itself. But, I really love my time here. The tech is wonderful. The people are great. And it's nice to be able to provide something that helps people, do a little bit better in the cyber world.
Yeah, you guys have had quite the journey so far, and definitely a unique organization at a unique time in the public sector as well. And you and I are going to cover a lot of ground, in terms of vulnerability management, continuous ATO, FedRAMP, all the things that we're going to talk about. I guess I'll start on the FedRAMP front. Wiz, if I'm not mistaken, recently received their FedRAMP high authorization. For folks not familiar with that, that's a no small feat whatsoever. It's very difficult, very time consuming, kind of speaks to the security of the platform and product that you all have built. I'm curious, when you look at efforts like FedRAMP 20X and what you guys are doing there, how is Wiz, collaborating with federal agencies, defense industrial based companies, and so on to kind of secure cloud environments?
Well, yeah, and I should back up. I should mention about myself. I've been, prior to Wiz, in and around government for about 2 decades. Most recently, I left being branch director for federal cybersecurity, working for the federal chief information officer and federal CISO. But, intimately familiar with FedRAMP for those reasons. FedRAMP was built, and I think it's important to kind of mention this, really for when the cloud was, new, and it was a place people were dumping data, right? It was like, you have a bucket, we're going to put some things in it. Obviously, that's not what the cloud looks like today, right? So it kind of was a really ingenious thing when it was built, saying, we're going to create a means for everyone to understand the security posture of these environments. Now, over time, as we built SaaS platforms and PaaS and kind of unique configurable environments, as well as kind of things that are just software in the cloud, what FedRAMP did not change too much. And it didn't create the agility necessary to keep up with the variation and different approaches within the cloud. The FedRAMP 20X process, which I personally think I'm excited about, there's been, White House visibility on this for years now, and the need to change this process. I think it's a great opportunity to see, how can we make this better? How can we make it so that, one, the product that the federal government is getting is as close to possible as what you're getting, and hopefully the same eventually as the product you're going to get in the private sector. Because right now with the FedRAMP process, everyone's creating a separate environment to deal with the slowness and complexity of that process. And I think there's an opportunity to really speed it up and ensure you're getting an identical product, or as near to identical as you want, while having that special security that government often needs. In addition, while we've been fortunate enough, as a company that's grown fast to be able to invest in this area, it's also acted as a barrier. So the 20X process is a lot about how do we automate that process. Now, we've had a lot of great opportunities to talk with the folks at FedRAMP and with agencies about how do we make this process quicker and more accessible to companies, and make it so that, when they enter this process, you're getting a lot of assurances, or even the same assurances that you would get, if not more, frankly, through the FedRAMP traditional process. So you have that security understanding and concern checked. But you're also moving faster, right? Historically, you have a third party come in, assess everything, goes back and forth. They do their assessment, then that package goes up to the FedRAMP team, and they have to assess it. In this new era, what we're hoping to see in the end is something where as much of what can be measured and met through automated tools is rapidly available to those who need to see them. And as much as you can take away, and by take away, I mean move out of the process of manual, all the better for everyone. If we can kind of technically verify things and make it machine readable, that's ideal. Now, there's a diversity of systems, and I like that they're still acknowledging that, right? So we can do things like ensure, let's say, that your policy makes sense for your system, right? There are certain things that are technically, we're just not going to always be able to do with some computer read situation. We need to do you have policies in place for people to do X, Y, Z? But you can measure, once you know what that policy is, you can measure that and do policy as code. And I think they're moving in that direction. I'm excited about their iterative process to get there. There's a lot of nervousness. Change creates nervousness, but I think, the attitude is right about it. The urgency is right about it. And hopefully the results we end with will be right too. Certainly the philosophy is there.
Yeah, I just had a deep dive last week with a guest about all things FedRAMP 20X. And like I've been in and around government a long time, and you kind of see some of these efforts come and go, and you often don't get too excited. They don't make the impact that you hope they will. But this one is truly been surprising so far. They're moving incredibly fast. The authorization numbers are climbing quickly, record paces. Saying all the right things about machine readable artifacts, real time, visibility of the cloud environments, as you said, machine readable artifacts, things like OSCAL, modernizing the way they approach vulnerability management, all these type of things. And I know Wiz is a big proponent of these things having, your kind of catchphrase of, from code to cloud and runtime visibility that you guys are a big champion of recently as well. How are you seeing some of the agencies and even, defense industrial based partners kind of tap into some of those capabilities to evolve the way they do, things like continuous monitoring, for example?
Yeah. And before I get into that, I should say also, like, to your point, I think it's really important to commend like Pete Waterman and the FedRAMP team for this iterative process, because they're using tools that the government always had available to them, but they're using it in new ways and creating urgency and movement that is keeping everyone on their toes in a good way, I think, because there's always a hesitancy to move forward, or the kind of what I would say a waterfall approach to policy. And this agile approach, I think, is something that's going to be repeatable in a lot of different ways. So kudos and hats off to them on that. But as far as, how we're talking to governments about it is kind of, this is kind of a gateway. What they're doing is a gateway to bring things on board from and meeting modern approaches, not just in cybersecurity, frankly, but in how we manage modern systems, right? And I think that is what Wiz helps offer in the cloud a lot of ways, is ways to speed up that process. So if I'm going to have a third party audit of my systems, let's just kind of start there when we're talking about things like CMMC, or we're going to be internally to government, kind of looking at the authorization, authorizing something to operate within government. I want to be able to have as much knowledge as that person and be able to share with them that visibility in a way that speeds up that process, right? Just as a baseline. So if I have full visibility into my system and understand the context and risk, not just that I have this many identities all over the place, but these identities linked to these kind of environments and only to these sensitive data sets, et cetera, I can come armed to have a real strong conversation in real time around risk and how we fit certain compliance models, right? It reduces that compliance friction. Now, if I can do what Wiz does also and align it with a lot of these models, and whether that be 853 Rev 5, getting nerdy with like what FedRAMP uses in the federal government, or it be where I have identified, sensitive data for CUI within CMMC, I can really quickly move through that process in a way that, the old pen and paper process of then verifying may not allow for, right? So that opens up a lot of doors to doing more CI/CD, more continuous updates to my environment, and reducing the time, whether it be my developers or frankly, my cyber defenders are spending on paperwork. And that, and really focusing on the greatest risks first, which is what we all want in the end, right?
Yeah, it's pretty fascinating because anyone who's been in this space, even on the policy side, if you weren't like a hands-on practitioner, when you heard the term continuous monitoring, that did not mean continuous, and often the monitoring meant like sampling of systems, a subset of systems, getting screenshots, kind of manually going out and validating control implementations. And that's just simply not the way the technology works nowadays. You can actually go out and do APIs, real-time continuous monitoring of these environments. As you mentioned, CI/CD integrations, for telemetry from the pipeline, all these kind of things that we just weren't taking advantage of. We've had the technology available. And, as you said, like hats off to them for taking an iterative approach here, because as you said, usually policy gets dumped in a big block. Like, here's how we're going to do it. They're taking an approach of like, let's try, different phases. Let's see what works. Let's iterate, make changes as we go. Kind of have a voice and active communication and dialogue with the community, which is often missing too in policy making. So it's been incredible to watch. And something else you brought up there is, things around vulnerability management, for example. Part of, and this applies whether it's CMMC, FedRAMP, NIST, ATOs, and risk management framework, internal to agencies. And again, this is another thing that your team has done quite well in terms of thinking about like attack paths and exploitability, reachability, all these kind of things that we just weren't talking about. Usually it was like, well, is it a CVSS critical? You got to fix it in X number of days. Like, none of these things matter, whether it was reachable, whether it was known to be exploited, like the CISO attack path analysis, things like that. What are your thoughts around how we're seeing vulnerability management in the public sector change too?
I think there is an understanding, and you can see this in the new vulnerability detection response requirements that FedRAMP put out. We're starting to get to the point where there's a recognition that one, it's not just about a vulnerability and a CVE, right? It's about where is that risk within the context of your environment. And it might not be a vulnerability at all in the traditional sense of a CVE. It might be something like a misconfiguration, right? It might be, an embedded secret. So understanding all of that and how much risk it involves in your environment is a very new concept to government, but it's being adopted in pockets. And I think as FedRAMP 20X gets formalized, as CISO starts to adopt that kind of viewpoint, I think we're going to get a lot farther, a lot faster. It also is going to require the agencies to get to change fundamentally how they're approaching vulnerability management, but also, frankly, how they're assessing and tackling risk, which I think it was always going to be necessary, right? Because the scale of what we're building, in whether it's public or private, in cloud and on-prem environments right now, is so complex that we are never going to hire our way out of this problem without changing how we organizationally work on these issues. But now, so more than ever, with this focus on efficiency, it's going to be tremendously important that government kind of get it right. And I'll just mention one thing real quick to point at how far we've come on this. Binding Operational Directive 2301, CISA's kind of way of saying to agencies, what you need to do as a binding operational directive is, at a minimum, you should be doing these things to secure your environments overall. 2301 focuses with vulnerability management and how often we scan systems and identify and have visibility. And, in 2023, we were arguing about how often they should scan. Should it be once a week? Maybe that's too much. We don't really know. And then in specific, it kind of ignores containers. It's just like, oh, you can't scan those. So the environment we live in today, where it's very much, you should be looking in your containers, period, full stop. You should be ensuring those are like as clean and hardened as possible, et cetera. That's all kind of things we have come to in the last, government is starting to realize, oh, no, that's definitely something we can do. And I think, we're going to have to be iterative with policy this way as well, and kind of keep advancing forward because things are moving so quickly. But particularly in this, how do we secure environments? What does a vulnerability look like in the very broad sense? So it's going to be an interesting ride.
Yeah, it's definitely been quite the evolution so far. And as you said, it's good to see the policy evolving to align with the technology and whether it's containerization, cloud security posture management. You called out rightly that, it's not just about known vulnerabilities and CVEs. There's misconfigurations, there's secrets management. There's all these things that, non-human identities is now becoming a problem that we're going to have to grapple with. Like, all these things need to be accounted for within policy, and then have the technical capabilities for the government and industry partners alike, to account for these risks. And I was going to ask you, and you talked about vulnerabilities and things like that there. I know Wiz is a CVE naming authority, a CNA, for folks not familiar with that acronym. And you've been speaking, pretty consistently, I think I've noticed, in the public and, some of the talks you do about the CVE program, the CNA participation. And honestly, like, I'm not the only one. I know that Wiz has an incredible research team. They're always dropping the, we discovered this new vulnerability. We discovered, it's incredible. And I think that that's kind of built some of the branding that Wiz has. So note to companies out there, get an amazing research team. But how is Wiz, participating in the CVE program? What are your thoughts around the future of the CVE program? It's kind of had some challenges and funding and things like that recently, but it's so critical to everything we do around vulnerability management, risk management, the public sector and the commercial space as well.
Yeah, one, I'll just kind of double down on what you said about our threat research team. They're amazing, and it's so much fun to watch them work and see the work they're coming out with. If folks want to see, it's all on our wiz.io/blog. There's a lot of, you can click on research. There's wonderful stuff coming out daily, and it's awesome to just kind of see between AI and cloud and some of the unique emerging tech, that what they're finding as far as risks. It's an interesting way to get around emerging risk before it becomes an exploited trend. But when it comes to the CVE program, about 6 to 8 months ago, there was a very concerning alert where essentially MITRE, who does a lot of the work on behalf of really the cyber ecosystem around the CVE program, kind of said, well, our funding's running out and we're not going to be able to run this anymore. Now, it wouldn't have stopped dead in its tracks. There would have been ways that it could continue forward. But, this is a program that has kind of grown up organically. And it kind of reminds me of that cartoon where there's a little piece of open source code hanging the whole internet. The CVE program is like that. It's kind of grown organically to become the lexicon we use to talk about risk in a common way. It's without it, in the bad old days, people would get different identifiers from different people around vulnerabilities and not be sure if they were talking about the same thing or not. It's often kind of what happens when we talk about, threat actors, and that's a little bit different of a situation. But like, now, is this a tiger or a typhoon, or is this a volt, or what are we talking about here? Before we had, a numbering of vulnerabilities, that is what happened. So it puts us in a better place. It's used internationally. So whether you care about cyber or not, like, this is the kind of thing that keeps us really quickly adapting to a changing environment. And when, whether it be Wiz identifies one of these and responsibly discloses it with the person who has to fix it, or, a threat actor finds it first and starts exploiting it, and we have to name it quickly and lock it down. This is what allows us to speak about it and ensure that this very underlying thing that runs everything we do works. Now, the funding was only extended a year. We need to figure out a way real quick to ensure that this never happens again, where there's a question about whether this underlying issue remains, like this underlying technology or process stays in place. I think one of the things we need to look at is diversifying funding in general, but also looking at, what in government's called no-year funding or whatever it may be that ensures that this process goes long term. It also needs updating and modernization. That's going to require more public-private partnerships, more working, frankly, with our international partners who now not only rely on the CVE programs, but are also creating their own vulnerability databases, as well as private sector who's doing that. We have a lot of things around cloud vulnerabilities, and there's a cloud vulnerability database out there. I think knitting this all together and modernizing it is going to be critical. And I think CISA has made the right pronouncements that they are dedicated to that process, which I commend them for. They're talking about bringing in international partners, focusing on data quality, working to essentially ensure that it's, the program is sustainable for the long term. Admire all of that. I think next comes us all working together to do it. I think actually going back to FedRAMP 20X, there's good lessons to be learned there. But this is going to take both dedication from the US government and CISA and the industry to move quickly, because a year of funding sounds like a relief, but if, there's a lot of things going on in the world right now, and it's very quick. It's going to be a quick turnaround if we don't create sustainability here.
Yeah, you call out a lot of things I want to highlight there. First off is like a year of funding sounds great, but the CISA, the CVE program, has been around for 25 years, and it's likely going to be around for 25 more. We need a long-term sustainable approach to this. And I did catch some of the commentary from Nick Anderson. I think he's the executive assistant director at CISA that got recently put into the role there. And he's making some great pronouncements, as you said, about the data quality of the program, the sustainability, cooperation internationally, things like that. They put out a great publication on that, which I'll link to in the show notes too. So I am feeling hopeful like you that we'll see a kind of a new future for the CVE program, fixing some of the legacy technical debt, having a more sustainable funding approach, cooperating better internationally, and things of that nature. Another hot topic in the community, obviously, it's been since the Cybersecurity Executive Order 14028, if I can still remember the correct digits, but was software supply chain security, SBOM, software bill of materials. Folks like Alan Friedman over at CISA and so on have been championing this for several years. Where does Wiz see SBOM in terms of how you guys play in that space? What you try to provide to folks that are looking to build and scale the use of SBOMs, and build a more robust supply chain security program as well.
Yeah, so I worked on this on the federal side, and I worked on it, where I am now. Wiz helps our customers in that area. We can provide SBOMs of executable environments and development environments. But, one of the things I realized when we were inside government even is just there's a lot of questions about the value of SBOMs. There's certainly a value to them. Everybody knows there's a value to them. So I think we should be really careful to say this is a great tool to have. The question is what and where to use it, right? I think if we're trying to store up a repository of all the SBOMs we could possibly use in a complex environment that is modern software, that's going to become like the junk drawer essentially in your house. There's going to be so much stuff in there that when you're looking for what you need, one, we don't know if it's going to be the updated most recent version of it, and you're going to have to call back over to that company to make sure you got the right information for the right versioning, et cetera, et cetera. And two, commend CISA for working on minimum requirements for it, but there are certain things that are going to apply to some software and not others. So I think from my standpoint, particularly when it comes to the cloud, which, by the way, is an area that still needs a lot of work from the SBOM standpoint of what does a minimum and good SBOM look like. I think we should be focused less on retaining SBOMs, unless, particularly for government, I should say, and much more on being able to procure those on demand. If you're a cloud environment, you should have the ability to create an SBOM. You should be able to have visibility into your environment to make a query of, your customers on demand when there is exigent risk or some sort of identified risk or vulnerability. And there's a good opportunity there for the US government in particular, who has some unique intelligence often and understanding of risk that us average folks may not, to kind of come to their partners and say, look, like, we want to either one, have an immediate SBOM of your environment, just so we can understand if there's certain risks that we're identifying, whether those are tactics, techniques, and procedures, or perhaps, a new vulnerability that's been identified. Or, they can say, hey, could you just do a quick check for us if XYZ exists, right? Those are things that the government should be able to expect of their vendors and have the open communication and dialogue to. That's going to make everybody better. So that's kind of where I see this all going, particularly as we start looking at things like AI bombs or H bombs, or things that this is all becoming much more complex, and how you update these things are becoming much more automated. So I think, understanding that having an existing database is only so good as the data you have in it. So creating an SBOM repository may not be the way to go. I think dedicating ourselves to certain requirements and practices is going to be a much more efficient way forward. And this is my humble opinion here.
No, I agree with you completely. And it's funny, we have this way, it's in government and in cyber in general, even in the commercial space, of like everything we do, it kind of becomes a check the box. And it's like, oh, SBOM check, we have it, it's in a shared drive somewhere. But like you're talking about operationalizing these things, making them part of broader acquisition and procurement, supply chain risk management programs, for example, having those dialogues with the vendor to be able to get it when you need it, using it for ongoing risk management efforts tied to incidents and things like that, which is where I think we need to be headed with it. And I think we're starting to get there. Initially, we kind of rallied around just getting the artifact, and it was like, okay, this is an exercise of futility. We're not using it to get any value from it. And I think we're starting to move towards a more mature approach now as an industry.
It's what my old boss used to call a rock exercise. Find me a rock, right? Like, who knows what kind of rock you're looking for. And, you just show up with a rock, maybe you check the box, right? And that's not what we want. We want something that's useful for everybody.
Yeah, agreed. And so another topic I want to ask you about is, in the DoD space, right? There's, and in federal more broadly, there's been a big push for continuous ATO. For folks that are not familiar with the term cATO, continuous ATO. And there's obviously other efforts underway, like DoD SWIFT and the Cybersecurity Risk Management Construct, if I got that one correctly, that came out relatively recently, kind of modernizing how they do risk management framework. And cATO now has spread beyond the DoD. It's at, VA, it's at USPTO, where I do some work. It's at other agencies as well. What are your thoughts around the continuous ATO, and how do you see Wiz kind of trying to help champion that concept?
Sure. Yeah. So let me just first say, like, I get extraordinarily frustrated with the fact that there is not a standardized expectation around continuous ATO. This has been for years now in not just, pockets, but the White House, the Office of Management and Budget has put out management memos and memos saying, you shall do this, right? And now I understand there's pocket cases. There's going to be high performance computing or IoT and OT systems that are not going to fit it. But if you have a traditional information system of any sort, whether it be in the cloud or on-prem, there's very little excuse for not doing continuous ATO at this point. Modern tool sets allow for it quite easily. And it's more about setting up the right processes to ensure that you are continuously monitoring the environment. And also, when you spin up new environments, you can move quickly to move them into an ATO process. These things exist. Wiz does this well, but other people do as well, to ensure that you have the visibility necessary, you understand the risk, you can do policy as code effectively to kind of say, all right, here are the boundaries. As long as we can make sure all these things are green, you have the ability to move forward, right? This doesn't have to be, and you can probably hear I'm getting annoyed because this is something I had to deal with both in New York. I used to work for the city of New York, as well as at the White House, is effectively, we have to ensure that people are building quickly, serving the American people, and that paper exercises aren't getting in the way, but also that we have the visibility to, back to our last conversation, not just check the box, but show where the real risk is and focus on that. So continuous ATO is a great step forward to being able to do that well. And I think, there's a real opportunity there as we kind of think about where focus should be for groups like CISA, for the, Federal Chief Information Officer and others, to really continue to modernize systems and focus, not just cybersecurity where it's needed most, but really it's about efficiency in government and service delivery in the end.
Yeah, I agree with you. It's been really frustrating to see this because it's been years of, kind of pockets of innovation and aspiration towards continuous ATO. And even there's been pushes at, like you said, the broader federal and executive levels, but it hasn't really come together in a cohesive strategy across the federal landscape yet, even though the tools exist. We understand how it can be done. I do hope that changes in the near future. And speaking of which, we've talked a lot about governmental policy and executive orders and things like that. And you're in a government affairs role, having been on the inside of government at the city level, as you talked about, at the federal level, now on the commercial industry side with a leader like Wiz, putting your governmental affairs hat on, how can we as industry kind of more effectively influence government policy to bring some of these long needed changes to this space?
Well, I think it's interesting. There's a lot of folks in leadership now who have worked in the technology sector and understand. And I think even if you look back the last couple administrations and this administration, there's a real understanding that none of this can be done without the private sector. I think there's increasing urgency and understanding that there's things government does well and can only do, and there's things that the private sector really does much, much better. And I think some of that is around, like, what do the processes of security look like focused on security outcomes that let us be agile in this space? There's a lot more focus on how do we adopt those operational practices, not just the tools, not just the items that make it up, but what do operational processes look like that allow us to move faster and more agile and reflect some of the best practices in the private sector. And I think, if we're going to tip our hat to folks in government who are looking that way, those are really the champions we should be looking for and raising up these days on the private sector side and finding to work with, and raising them up as examples to the decision makers and policymakers who are really looking for wins right now. They're really looking at saying, hey, how can we make things more efficient and effective? How can we be more secure at the same time? So if we can show that value and try and highlight those, we're going to move in the right direction. I have a feeling. I do think, look, there's some fundamental things that with government and the way it works that just makes things take time. But, call me an eternal optimist on this. I do think there's, if we can get the funding right, if we can get the focus, we can bring the right solutions forward. And I think there's a lot of consensus these days around what those are.
Yeah, I think we're seeing a unique time in terms of, like you said, the convergence of folks from the commercial sector that have a deep technical expertise, the ongoing through multiple administrations, understanding that we need to collaborate with the private sector. We need to change the way we do things in terms of process and procedure around cybersecurity and IT more broadly, in tech in general. And you used, the buzzword that I can't let you go without bringing up now, which is AI. So when we look at AI in the federal and the public sector, defense industrial base, you name it, what are your thoughts around the rapid adoption of AI, kind of balancing that with some of the risks of AI, but also the opportunities of where we can use AI for more effective things like ATOs, control, documentation aspects, even cyber defense, ongoing cyber defense. Like, what are your thoughts around the topic of AI in the public sector right now?
Yeah, I think it's it's wild to think that, 2 to 3 years ago, we were debating a pause on AI in general, right? That's not where we live. In fact, 85% of the environments that Wiz protects has some form of AI technology in it, which is just a wild statistic considering that Kubernetes, which is pretty standard, cloud functionality, is in 75% of the environment. So it is everywhere, right? So I think the first acknowledgement is, AI has arrived, it's ubiquitous. It's too good a tool for us to just say, well, let's think about this more. But it is also novel, right? And the administration has made clear that, and frankly, the private sector has made clear also that we are going to drive forward fast and find the use cases for AI. But it is a novel by definition software, right? It is new, and it's complex and it has differences that we're not used to. We've been building, just to use something old fashioned like an S3 bucket in the cloud for years. We know when we change something about it, we understand there might be new risks and we can adjust for that. AI is tremendously new and novel in different ways. And looking at that complexity means we have to be doing more continuous monitoring and risk assessment and building resiliency around those systems. And that's going to take a lot of AI purpose-driven tools to look at those AI-enabled environments to ensure security. So we shouldn't run away from AI as an issue, but as we adopt it, we also have to be looking at securing it in new ways and bringing in, the best practices of the private sector, as we were talking about earlier, but also recognizing it's going to be a while till we build standards because it's so new, because it's evolving so fast. So focusing on the resiliency, learning as much as we can and adapting quickly, things that the government has still struggles with, but we have to, it's a must really, because we're finding a lot of basic run-of-the-mill vulnerabilities in a lot of AI platforms and services and open source code, because it's being delivered so fast, right? There's so many new things coming out so quickly. But two, we're also seeing some unique things to AI, like risks around trouble isolating it, things like that we have to pay particular attention to. So, this is something we're going to have to go arm in arm in and just kind of work on to ensure we deliver the best products and I'm talking about government there as well as, private sector, but also have our eyes wide open and be doing the right things to secure it. And that's going to take immediate actions and immediate visibility and not waiting until we have concerns down the road.
Yeah, it's definitely a unique kind of double-edged sword where it has this potential to really transform a lot of governmental processes, digital environments, the way we do things, but it also, as you said, introduces novel risks and things like that. And we do want to have some governance and policy and structure around it, but we don't want to be too quick to roll those out when we don't even understand the technology quite yet or how it's going to be used. So it's a really difficult dichotomy I think we're going to have to kind of balance as we go forward in the next 12, 24 months and beyond. So we've kind of run the gamut of everything from FedRAMP 20X, continuous ATO, SBOM, supply chain, AI, you name it. As we wrap up here, aside from checking out the website, of course, at wiz.io, anything else you want to throw out there? Keep an eye out from you or the team.
No, I just would say there's more interesting, there's so much innovation going on in the cyber realm as well. Obviously, AI is helping with defense and things like that to bring it back to our last bit there. But in general, the defenders are doing some really interesting things. And I think looking at some of the companies like Wiz who have been growing in unique new ways, I think it's always been hard to keep up, but I think it's been kind of on rocket fuel in the last few years. I encourage everyone to kind of understand that, this environment will keep changing at a rapid pace, but kind of also figuring out how, not just on the technology side, not just on the threat adaptation side, but how do we change our processes also and our frankly, our organizational structures to be agile around this in an intentional way is really something that I think is going to be exciting for policymakers, but also is going to require the private sector to be an active participant in it. And, I think that's what's probably most exciting about these times.
Yeah, it's definitely a unique time, as you said, and you're at a unique company to be at this time, an industry leader like Wiz who's, set records on multiple fronts and now combine forces with Google, pending any regulatory, craziness that may happen there. But it's an amazing opportunity for you and the industry and the government, right, to leverage these technologies that we're seeing. So I appreciate you coming on, Mitch, and covering all these topics with me, and I look forward to chatting again soon.
That sounds good. Loved it. Thanks, man.
Take care.
See ya.